Imagine a colossal tree stretching up into the sky amidst a snowy, frozen tundra. Its canopy can be seen from dozens of miles away, and it looms over the surrounding landscape like an organic skyscraper. This tree promotes growth and life, and its magic reaches all across the land around it. This is the region known as Tarskef. Alright, let's break this up into segments. Some of the sections are going to overlap with each other, so bits of info relating to one section might show up in another relevant section. Let's start with Tarskef itself. What kind of place is it? Tarskef is a frigid land far to the north consisting of, primarily, two different types of biomes: taiga, or boreal forest, and Arctic tundra. A taiga is a biome consisting mostly of coniferous forest, and due to how far north it is, usually experiences very cold temperatures, especially during winter. Speaking of cold temperatures, when you go north far enough, or even high enough in elevation, eventually you hit a point where it gets too cold for trees to grow. This is called the tree line. There are some other factors that can affect that, but that's the very simplified version. That's why you don't see trees at the tip-top of Mount Everest, among other reasons, or the northernmost regions in places like Canada or Russia. This far north is where Arctic tundras begin. In addition to their extremely cold temperatures, Arctic tundras also experience very low precipitation, technically making them deserts. While it's too cold for trees, smaller, shorter plants like grasses, shrubs, lichens, and mosses are able to grow since they're more resilient to the colder temperatures, and their roots don't need to go below the layer of permafrost in the ground. So essentially, Tarskef is a rugged, frigid land with cold, boreal forest to the south and an even colder tundra further north. Let's address the elephant in the room, or rather the tree in the field. The big tree. This gigantic piece of lumber is known as Nurza. As you can probably tell, this is no ordinary tree. Nurza is what is known as a great tree, one of the old gods in this setting. This video isn't really about the old gods, so all you need to know is that, a very long time ago, there were primordial forces that ruled the land, things like sentient thunderstorms and wildfires, and even several different great trees scattered around. Well, as it turned out, a lot of these old gods were very destructive and made life for the smaller life forms pretty miserable. So to make a long story short, there was a big war and most of the old gods were struck down, leaving only a handful of the great trees as the last remnants of the old gods, since they never really hurt anyone. As far as what they do and why they're worshipped and even regarded as gods in the first place, the great trees have a kind of regional effect. Within a radius spanning several miles, life tends to flourish and experience a boost in growth. Both plants and animals feel these effects, but there is a catch. This boost only affects wild life forms that don't have a higher intelligence. Basically anything organic that isn't capable of developing civilizations. For plants, these effects may include things like making them larger or more bountiful, or even allowing them to grow in places that would normally be inhospitable to them. For animals, the most common effect that they experience is that some of them grow much larger than would normally be possible. I'll talk a little more about that in the wildlife section. They also receive a little bit of sustenance from the great tree's regional aura, allowing them to go a little longer without food and water before they starve or dehydrate. The great trees don't really do anything that directly benefits any kind of people, but they do benefit indirectly by having more plants to forage and more animals to hunt. In terms of their physicality, the wood from these trees is much more durable, and their sap has pretty potent healing properties. However, since many people worship these trees and hold them in great reverence, harvesting them for their parts is considered sacrilegious. So instead of actively seeking out the tree's resources, people will passively gather any fallen branches or leaking sap and consider it as a good omen. Many of the cultures that worship these great trees believe that the reason these titanic entities reach so high up into the sky is so that when the trees and their worshippers die, their spirits can ascend even further and become the auroras, dancing across the endless expanse above in ethereal light with their ancestors. These auroras can be seen wherever there currently are, or even were, great trees. So, who exactly worships Nurza? Well, a few different groups, the first of which are the Minotaurs. The varying tribes of Minotaurs in Tarskef are not a unified people, but they do share a common culture. They are a strong, hardy, and oftentimes devoted people. And honestly, you'd have to be to live in a place like this. From the small plants to the massive animals, resilience and endurance are necessary traits for survival. They put great emphasis and value into family and the community of the tribe because there is definitely greater strength in numbers, and being able to rely on those with whom they share a close bond will give them a much-needed advantage for survival. They live in small camps and villages scattered around the region, and each tribe is probably no larger than a few dozen at the most. As for their culture and lifestyle, I think they would be herbivores. I know some depictions of minotaurs have them as meat-eating monsters, but I like the idea of them being less monstrous and more bovine. They have large, flat teeth and a strong bite force, so I think it would be cool if there was some kind of tuber or root that they could grow as one of their sources for food. I'll call this a shaz root. These roots are extremely dense and tough, but are also packed full of nutrients. For the regular humanoid species, the shaz roots are much too difficult to chew, but the Minotaur's powerful teeth and jaws are perfect for them, so they're an important part of the Minotaur's diet. They aren't herbivores 100% of the time. Most herbivores aren't, so they'll occasionally eat meat if they're close to starving or have nothing else. They mostly farm and forage for plants, but I think they would also hunt as well, since parts of animals would still be useful to them, like hides or antlers. As devout worshippers of Nurza, and many things nature-related, they would want to utilize every part of an animal if they kill it, even the meat that they rarely eat, and that's where their companions come into play. On their own, the Minotaurs are decent hunters, but they excel by using their domesticated wolves as hunting companions. Some Minotaurs keep entire packs of these wolves, allowing them to take down prey much larger than themselves. Whatever meat that the Minotaurs don't need from a kill, the wolves will happily devour. Due to their size and muscle mass, the Minotaurs make for fierce warriors. However, since most of their lifestyle is centered around survival, they don't really have much in terms of armies or martial training. In combat, they usually rely on their raw strength and wits, rather than specific tactics and maneuvers. Although that isn't to say that their existence is without warfare. The tribes each have their own territory carved out, but sometimes those tribes come into conflict over resources, challenging established borders, or even blood feuds that go back decades. Each tribe has a chieftain who is elected, not chosen in some ritualistic challenge or fight. Strength is an important aspect of Minotaur culture, but they're also a pragmatic people, so they value other traits as well. They understand that their leader needs to be able to actually lead them. Usually the chieftain will be strong, but not necessarily the strongest of the tribe. The specific qualities will vary from tribe to tribe, but generally speaking, a competent chieftain will be able to settle internal and external matters fairly, delegate tasks to the right people, and manage their resources properly, knowing when and when not to take a risk. Each tribe also has a tree mother, a female elder who acts as a spiritual and magical guide for the tribe, advising on any matters relating to the elements, Nurza, or nature magic. They're called tree mothers because they can perform shamanistic rituals to commune with Nurza. It isn't like a two-way conversation though. The tree mothers receive signs from Nurza, maybe a vague vision that feels like trying to remember a dream, or sudden changes in the wind or temperature, or strange anomalies like a plant growing where it normally couldn't. It's up to the tree mothers to interpret those signs to understand Nurza's will. However, Nurza is only on one side, and that is the side of life. It doesn't seem to value any one life form over another, so it won't try to give one thing a big advantage over another thing. It won't get directly involved in the feuds of the life forms below, but it may give subtle nudges to advance life and growth in the region as a whole. In terms of what kind of magic the Minotaurs actually do, they're a bit diversified, but under a common theme, that being Nurza. They don't really do any of the studied forms of magic, like, say, wizardry, but are instead closer to druids, and use all kinds of nature magic. Initially, I was inclined to make them all Arctic Circle druids, given the very cold place that they're in. But since Nurza is both a big presence physically within the land and religiously within their culture, I think many of them would be Forest Circle druids instead, although there probably are some Arctic Circle ones further north. There's also another way that the Minotaurs who worship Nurza practice their magic, but I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. Most of the tribes keep to the southern or mid-level regions of Tarskef since it becomes more dangerous and more difficult to acquire food the further north you go. In addition to the fearsome wildlife, they also have other factions to worry about, besides rival Minotaur tribes, the most noteworthy being the Centaurs. In contrast to the Minotaurs being herbivores, the Centaurs are carnivores. On their own, they're able to pursue and run down their prey, usually something about the size of a caribou if they're hunting solo. But when they work together as a herd, they can easily take down much larger and more dangerous animals like mammoths. Sometimes they'll supplement their diet with plants, like berries for example, but for the most part, they're carnivorous. Going back to the herds, the Centaurs are usually organized into clans and tribes, similar to the Minotaurs, but where they differ from the Minotaurs is that the Centaurs have much more infighting and animosity towards the other tribes. This is mostly because of two reasons: old blood feuds that get perpetuated by a cycle of violence, and competition for hunting territory. This means that the Centaurs are equally as hostile with the Minotaurs as they are with their own rival tribes. Due to their, biology, the Centaurs are more acclimated to the open fields, snowy plains, and even lightly wooded areas rather than the dense forests. They have territories all over the region, and will occupy areas much further north since there is still some game to hunt up there. I think the Centaurs would be semi-nomadic, roaming their territories seasonally looking for food, but also having settlements and camps that they can retreat or fall back to. Because of the harsh conditions, food scarcity is absolutely a thing, so many tribes will constantly have their borders challenged as other tribes try to encroach on their hunting grounds. As you can probably tell from the amount of times I've talked about it already, hunting is a big part of the Centaurs' culture. They enjoy the thrill and challenge of it and incorporate it into many aspects of their societies. For example, as opposed to the Minotaurs, Centaur chieftains are decided by a challenge. When their leader dies, or even if someone challenges the current leader, the new chieftain is decided by a hunting competition. Whoever can hunt down the biggest or most impressive creature becomes the new chieftain. Many of the Centaurs are adorned in the trophies of their most impressive kills, so the chieftains will usually be the most visually striking. However, I don't think they hunt for sport in a wasteful manner. Like the Minotaurs, if they kill something, they're going to make use of every part of it. They also just happen to enjoy the hunt itself as well. The Centaurs are also worshippers of Nurza, but their practices differ from the Minotaurs. Where the Minotaurs make full use of the magic available to them, the Centaurs instead believe that all the magic they need is already around them. They believe that Nurza provides them with the necessary tools and resources to survive and conquer. To them, Nurza already makes life flourish and bountiful. In their minds, such large creatures have been made as a challenge for them to overcome. I think this also plays into their pride for hunting and warfare. They don't really consider magic as part of their skill set. They're a much more physical people, so when they defeat something, they want it to be with their own tangible skills rather than something they draw upon. One of these specialized skills is falconry, the act of using a bird of prey to assist in hunting. They primarily use Gyrfalcons, although they're bigger than they normally would be due to Nurza's effect on the region. A falconer in Centaur culture is a prestigious role and takes a great deal of training for both the Centaur and their avian companion. The falcons imprint on their centaur when they hatch, and will form a very close bond over their lifespan. These large birds will assist in tracking prey, and are even powerful enough to take on medium-sized mammals like caribou, though this is usually done in conjunction with their centaur. I imagine the falcon would be used to locate and then flush out their quarry so the centaur can then run it down. They can also be used to scout for any threats within a certain distance, like other centaurs, minotaurs, or large predators. For the centaurs, these Gyrfalcons are like family, so the loss of one is devastating. Normally, I think they can live from about 12 to 20 years, but because of Nurza's influence, these larger Gyrfalcons could potentially live up to 30, although that's a rare feat given the violent lifestyle these birds live. At the base of Nurza, nestled between its massive roots, lies the holy city of Nurzalhof. Well, maybe city is a bit generous. It's easily the largest settlement in Tarskef, but it's probably only about the size of a small town in a more forgiving climate. Nurzalhof was established as a kind of centralized safe haven for the worshippers of the Great Tree, but all are welcome. Minotaurs, centaurs, and even the dwarves, which I'll talk about later. Nurzalhof is a crossroads for trade, and trade is exactly what they do here. I think with a difficult environment like this, bartering would be the main way people exchange goods and services, rather than some kind of money or social credit. In a place as dangerous as Tarskef, no amount of gold will save you. Instead, you'll be kept alive by what you know, what you can do, and what you can carry. This means that things like tools, food, weapons, any kind of physical thing to make life and survival easier will be the highest forms of currency. The reason for this strange peace, despite the numerous feuds and territory clashes, is because no one would dare to shed blood on this sacred, holy site. Violence is outlawed within the city itself and out to a certain radius beyond the tree. Most people respect this rule, but on the very rare occasion that it's violated, the keepers of the tree will step in. The Keepers are a holy order of paladins, clerics, and druids who swear sacred oaths and devote their lives to protecting both the great tree Nurza itself and its surrounding territory. They draw upon Nurza's divine power, using a mixture of holy and nature magic. Due to their close ties with Nurza's magic, I think this order would be composed solely of minotaurs, since the centaurs don't really practice magic, and the dwarves have a different religion. These servants of the Great Tree are adorned in either iconography depicting the tree, or even pieces of it that have fallen off. Maybe a cleric's staff is carved from part of a branch, or a paladin's shield from a chunk of bark. Again, they don't intentionally strip the tree for its parts, but instead make use of anything that naturally falls off. These pieces would be considered sacred and passed down through the generations. Sometimes they have to venture out beyond the territory of Nurzalhof to combat any forces that would oppose Nurza, or even deal with events that could prove to be issues for the tree. I'll touch on those things a bit later. The last thing I'll mention about the Keepers is that, while they are minotaurs, they stay out of any feuds or disputes between the tribes, even if they were previously part of one. They have to maintain their neutrality to ensure that Nurzalhof is always welcome to anyone seeking peace. To the southwest, at the base of a mountain range, is a sprawling field of hot springs. Hot water bubbles up from the ground below, heated by magma deep under the earth. This warm refuge is home to the dwarves in this region, though you wouldn't be able to tell at first glance. This is because their settlement is actually underground, beneath the surface of the lone hill overlooking the hot springs. This small town is known as Stelgen. Stelgen is a relatively new settlement compared to the rest of the ancient history of Tarskef, being founded about 20 years ago. Dwarves are not native to this region, and instead migrated here to get away from some warfare to the south of Tarskef. They couldn't go southeast since that's where their opposition lived, and they couldn't go southwest since those people didn't like them either, so the only other place they could go was north. For months, they wandered the frigid landscape, combating both the terrain itself and its ferocious inhabitants as they searched for a suitable place to settle down. The centaurs would almost always attack on sight, but with the minotaurs it was 50-50. Some tribes were helpful, offering them advice for surviving this land, and even trading supplies with them. but other tribes were fiercely territorial and drove the dwarves out of their borders. Eventually, the dwarves discovered the hot springs as they were exploring the nearby mountains. Fortunately for them, the hot springs were at the edge of a friendly Minotaur tribe's territory. The Minotaurs were sympathetic to the dwarves' search for a home, so they allowed the dwarves to carve out their own territory around the hot springs. From there, a close kinship was forged between these two unlikely allies. The dwarves are industrious and inquisitive people, so they began to seek out suitable places to mine for metals and minerals soon after establishing their new home. They forged weapons and tools with the metals they extracted from the ground, and they traded them to the Minotaurs in exchange for their hospitality and assistance. The dwarves also discovered a large cavern under the central hill. Within this cavern is a small lake, heated by the magma deep below. Steam rises and vents from an opening at the top of this hill. They also burrowed into the hill to gain access to the cavern, where they began to construct their settlement, building their homes with stone and bricks on the patch of ground within. While this terrain isn't too much different compared to their old home, it's still further north than they're used to, so there's a bit of a learning curve for them to adapt to. They're more technologically advanced compared to the other societies in this region, but that will only carry them so far. Over time, and through a lot of trial and error and guidance from the Minotaurs, they've slowly become more acclimated to this environment. They're decent warriors, though they're a bit disadvantaged compared to the much larger and stronger species. They're okay at farming, being able to grow some crops during the short growing seasons, and they're pretty good at hunting. But where I think their true strength lies is with their ingenuity. The weaponry and armor and tools they're able to forge with various metals are not to be underestimated, especially when compared to the more primitive technology other societies use. Because of this, I think the dwarves would do very well at the markets in Nurzalhof, trading their metalwork for essential supplies that the other species are better at gathering. Speaking of this holy site, while the dwarves certainly acknowledge that Nurza is very much a real god and has some kind of divine power, the dwarves don't really worship nature in that way, or at all. They have their own god, which I might talk about in a later video, but that specific god isn't really relevant to Tarskef. Anyways, they're not as nature-oriented as the other species, but some of them do practice a bit of the more studied types of magic. Earlier, I mentioned that the dwarves are also inquisitive in nature. Some of the dwarves in Stelgen take great interest in archaeological ruins and mysteries. They like uncovering the past and learning about those that came before. And Tarskef actually happens to have a decent amount of that stuff. Scattered around the, mostly, western half of Tarskef are a bunch of very old stone ruins. The dwarves haven't been in Tarskef that long, so they've only done a handful of expeditions to these ruins. However, they have made a few notable discoveries so far. As far as they can tell, these ruins belonged to some kind of human kingdom or state. They know it's human because they've uncovered a few tombs with surprisingly well-preserved and embalmed bodies, all of which are human. In some of the other non-tomb ruins, the dwarves have also found iconography depicting what they believe to be Nurza. They aren't yet sure whether these humans worshipped Nurza or were just making art of it since it's such a massive fixture of the land. They also aren't exactly sure how old these ruins are. By their estimates, given their archaeological expertise, they think some of these ruins may be up to a couple thousand years old. The dwarves have asked some of the Centaur and Minotaur tribes if they know anything about the ruins, and while the beast folk are aware of them, they don't seem to know anything about this fallen civilization. Whatever happened to them happened so long ago that any knowledge of it has been swallowed by time. The dwarves don't have many theories about the fate of this civilization. There just isn't enough evidence to point to any one cause for their disappearance. Currently, there aren't any native humans in Tarskef, so there aren't any living descendants. I think some of the Minotaur tribes would have taken refuge in some of the ruins for shelter and fortification, but also making sure to stay away from any tombs so as not to disturb the dead. From what the dwarves can tell, any occupation of the ruins happened long after the humans disappeared, meaning they don't think the humans were invaded and replaced. Perhaps they'll uncover more information as time goes on. To the east of these ruins, in the center of Tarskef, is a lone stone tower standing in the middle of the frozen tundra. The architecture of these ruins is much different compared to the western ones, leading the dwarves to think that they might not be connected. Another reason that the dwarves don't think this is part of the other civilization is that there are corpses or statues of stone men scattered around the tower, not humans. Strangely, neither the tower nor the stone men seem to have sustained any damage from weathering. This is very perplexing to the dwarves, given that, according to the minotaurs and centaurs, this tower has been here just as long as the other ruins, maybe even longer. The native tribes don't seem to have any kind of generational memory of its origin. It just seems like something that's always been there. There also seems to be some kind of barely detectable, subtle magic surrounding the tower and the stone men. Because of its ominous nature, the natives call this place the Ruins Taboo, and make sure to stay away from it. I imagine there's a lot of debate among the dwarves for whether they should or shouldn't try to enter the tower. Some of them lean more to the cautious side, since they barely know what's outside, let alone inside the tower. Whereas others believe that to be the reason that they should try to enter the tower. To them, this is easily the strangest mystery in Tarskef, so they're eager for any answers. To the east of this tower and northwest of Nurza are a clustered series of chasms and ravines. Within the steep, rocky walls, Nurza's roots have pierced through from one side to the other. But despite the presence of the old god, this is not a place of safety. A group of remoras, giant worm centipede monsters whose backs glow from an intense fire within, have started nesting within the walls of these ravines. Because of their burrowing and intense heat that radiates from their bodies, Nurza's roots have started to take on some damage. Most of them are younger adolescents, probably a little smaller than a human, but there is one fully grown adult lurking in the depths, about 20 to 30 feet tall. These monstrous bugs rarely venture out from their dens, only going up to the surface to hunt or ambush anything that gets too close to the ravines. The keepers of the tree have started to send out some of their members to exterminate some of the remoras, but it's an extremely difficult task. Not only are they having to battle dangerous monsters, but they're also fighting them in very unforgiving terrain. I imagine they've sustained a few losses. Let's move to the more northern parts of Tarskef. Now, I know it's not actually something that happens, but I think the idea of an elephant graveyard is really cool, so Tarskef is going to have some mammoth graveyards. There are probably several of them scattered across the region. If a mammoth reaches old age, it'll begin to feel its life slipping away. It will then journey across the tundra towards its final resting place. Strangely, whether they can smell death in the mammoth's bones, or whether they have some kind of supernatural sense for it, most predators won't bother a mammoth that's headed to a graveyard. Though this may be because a dying mammoth will go berserk and use the last of its strength fighting anything that would get between it and its final place of rest. Sometimes mammoth herds will make the journey to these graveyards to pay their respects to their ancestors. The northwestern coast of Tarskef is covered in bog-like, marshy wetland. This is what's called a muskeg. It's essentially just a really cold bog. Where a swamp is a flooded forest with a lot of trees and healthy vegetation, bogs are flooded areas with a lot smaller plants like various mosses and sedges, even small trees too. One of the main differences though is that bogs, or muskegs in this case, consist of a lot of peat, which is a bunch of those mosses and sedges and trees decayed into clumps of, it's kind of like soil, but it's made out of dead plants. The reason it's so flooded is because when it precipitates, that water doesn't really have anywhere to flow out to, and it can't drain into the ground because of the permafrost, so the water just stays there. Trees can grow in a muskeg, but because the water is so acidic and just not a great environment for growth, the trees don't grow all the way. There are some rivers that flow through this area, so it might be a little swampier around the rivers themselves, but otherwise this area is just miles and miles of frigid bog. Northeast of this vast, boggy expanse, in the northernmost mountain range, a white dragon named Flourish has made her home in the glaciers that sit between the jagged mountain peaks, inside of a glacier cavern, mounting trophies of her kills on the icy walls. Fun fact about glacier caves, some of them can be accessed from the surface through a kind of pit or a well called a Mulan? I don't know, man. And they can be pretty big, up to 30 feet wide, and going down into the glacier hundreds of feet, oftentimes opening up into large caverns at the bottom of the glaciers. Whenever Flourish needs food, she'll slither out of her frozen lair to hunt down anything within flyable distance. I think she would also freeze some creatures completely solid and fly them back to her cavern to feast on later. She is a solitary creature and doesn't concern herself with the territory squabbles to the south. There isn't much treasure in the traditional sense found in Tarskef, so I like the idea of her hoarding and collecting bones, rather than gold and gems. While the Minotaurs, Centaurs, and Dwarves are the three dominant groups in Tarskef, there are others that inhabit the land. Far in the north, frost giants make their home among glaciers, icebergs, and frigid shores. Several generations ago, the frost giants were one unified tribe ruling over northern Tarskef. Their king was a strong, proud leader who was loved by his people, as were his twin sons. One day, while out hunting, the king encountered a white dragon, the mate of Flourish. Both of them refused to back down, so they began a bloody and gruesome battle. The king slew the dragon, but succumbed to his wounds shortly after. When the giants learned of their king's death, each of the twins thought that they were the rightful heir, and so the kingdom was split in half. One side favored one brother, and the other side favored the other brother. Their feud still rages to this day. There probably aren't a lot of frost giants since they are so big and need a lot of resources to survive compared to the smaller species, so there are only a few dozen at the most. Because of the high demand for resources, they're fiercely territorial. When they aren't fighting each other, they're usually keeping centaurs from encroaching too far into their borders or trying to protect their mammoths, they herd mammoths by the way, from Flourish. Moving back to the muskeg, this place is very sparsely populated by anything even remotely resembling civilization. In fact, the only hint of civilization out here is a small hut where a hag, it's a hag, named Belgra lives. Belgra spends her days using her witch magic to create blizzards and terrible winter weather for anyone who gets close to or even enters the muskeg. She also enjoys putting hexes and curses on the bog yetis that live in this area. Bog yetis are like normal yetis, except they live in bogs instead of mountains. They are ambush predators who lurk in the peat and muck, stalking their prey or waiting for it to get close before they strike. The reason that Belgra has such a hatred for them is because the bog yetis will sometimes eat the harpies that also live in this region. The harpies are loyal to Belgra and will keep her informed about anything happening in the area. The yetis do not like Belgra, but most of them are too scared to attack her, so they try to stay out of her way. All across Tarskef, warbling bits of laughter can sometimes be heard. This laughter is from the packs of Arctic gnolls that roam the land. These gnolls act as bandits and scavengers, killing and stealing anything they can. Some of the more fearless packs will stalk the edge of Nurzalhof's territory, attempting to rob any people or caravans headed to or from the Holy City. Though they're not stupid, they know to stay a decent distance away from the border, or else they'll be struck down by the Keepers of the Tree. The last faction I'm going to cover is technically a group of outsiders, but they still operate in Tarskef. They don't have an official name, but they're a group of cultists and necromancers who worship death. This cult is composed of the fragmented remnants of another death cult to the southeast, who tried to corrupt a different great tree and turn it into a death tree, something that would promote decay and death instead of growth and life. However, this cult was overwhelmingly defeated and nearly wiped out. The survivors regrouped and fled to Tarskef to try to corrupt Nurza instead, for two reasons. Compared to the other great trees to the south, Nurza is less fortified and protected, and the overall population of Tarskef is much lower, so there's less resistance. The other reason is that this cult likes to make use of the human ruins to the west, breaking into the tombs and resurrecting the dead bodies as zombies. They don't have many members, but their influence is slowly growing as they build their undead army. The Keepers of the Tree are aware of them, so sometimes the Keepers will send out groups to confront known cult locations. I think they would also work with the Dwarves to seal off certain tombs before the cult can get there to harvest more zombies. Tarskef has a lot of wildlife, similar to what you would find here on Earth. Caribou, bison, wolves, Arctic foxes, moose, owls, falcons, whales, and many, many more. If it lives in the Arctic or subarctic regions of Earth, there's a good chance it lives in Tarskef as well. However, due to Nurza's influence, there are a few abnormalities. One such creature is the giant frog. Now, you might be thinking, frogs in a cold place such as this? To which I would reply, the wood frog. This little creature can be found all across North America, even in Alaska and the northern parts of Canada. The interesting thing about this specific frog is that they can survive being mostly completely frozen. The science is a little beyond me, but from what I understand, it's because their bodies can pump a bunch of glucose around, which acts as a kind of antifreeze and prevents their cells from being damaged while freezing and thawing. These frogs can then stay frozen for up to 8 months. No movement, no breathing, no heartbeat, just a little frog sickle. This brings me to the giant frogs in Tarskef. They're very similar to the real wood frog, just much bigger, sometimes the size of a boulder, and they live in one specific region, the hot springs where the dwarves are. In the summer, they spend their days lounging around the warm waters of the spring, eating birds and small mammals. And then, when winter arrives, they find a nice spot to settle down in and freeze solid, leaving giant frozen frog statues all around the area. They then thaw in the summer. A few other examples of creatures that have been enlarged by Nurza would be polar bears, elk, and owls. Unlike the frogs, there isn't really anything notable about these large animals. They've just been scaled up from Nurza's magic. Though not every animal of those species receives the effects. There are still regular-sized polar bears and elk and owls, it's just that there are also sometimes large ones. There doesn't seem to be a concise reason for why some receive the effect, but others don't. I think the people in Tarskef would refer to these animals as kings, like a king polar bear, a king owl. Alright, so that's Tarskef. This is a cold and unforgiving land, and yet life still manages to flourish despite the harsh conditions. In a land where death is so very easy to come by, survival is going to be at the forefront of every living creature's mind. This produces all kinds of life that has been hardened and conditioned to withstand such frigid adversity. Thanks for watching.